Guys, in our last video, we completed our creation of an Ajax form that allowed us to more dynamically submit student enrollments to each course. And in this video, we will be going through adding an automatic refresh for each form submission. So what happens right now is that we get a visual cue each time a student is successfully or not successfully added. However, we don't know who is added because there's no list here for viewing. We would have to go back to list and view the enrollments each time, which we want to avoid. And so what we're going to be doing is enhancing our current form such that each time a student is added successfully, a grid will be down here showing the list of students and it will refresh. And in addition to this, we will be looking at the concept of partial forms. Now, the first modification we are going to make is to change the labels of our controls here on our form. In Visual Studio, I added a metadata class for the enrollment table, and we did that in a previous lecture. So I did it this time for the enrollment table, but you would notice that I did add the data attribute tag for the IDs. However, on our page, they still said student ID and course ID. So long story short, the display name doesn't really work for the IDs, but that's no problem because we can always just go to our view, that's our create view, and we can just change those manually. So I'm going to leave the original code there and I'm going to retype it. So I will say label and say for, and the advantage of this label for, as you notice, this is a label for element and it's pointing to the course ID. So really and truly what this label and for attribute here does in the original HTML is it allows that when you click the label, it automatically highlights whatever element is being targeted. So the label for course ID would just highlight our drop-down list with the course ID as its ID. Next, inside this very label, I'll just add the class and I'll just copy and paste the bootstrap classes that were originally generated with our control. Take out that @ sign because this is just pure HTML. This is not our Razor code. So we have the label for course ID and we gave it the bootstrap classes, and then the manual text I would like to type is course. And then I can just remove this line and I will repeat this for the student name. And now that we've completed that, we can change the button text to maybe enroll and then change the button class to BTN success. So we get a green button, and I'm just going to say BTN dash block. All right. So you can get creative, of course. Now, like we said in the beginning, the expectation is that each time we click or submit and we get a successful response from our JSON or controller, each time a student is added successfully, then we expect that there is going to be a refresh. So what we're about to do is to create a partial view that is going to handle only displaying the students who are enrolled. Now, the concept of a partial view is you want a view within a view. And let me just put that into perspective a bit. So remember that we have a layout page, and in the layout page, we actually render a view. So a view is a part of the layout page. Well, a partial view is actually designed to be a part of an existing view. So we have this view, and what we want to do is to create another mini view inside this view that is solely responsible for loading a particular bit of information, which would be the enrollments. And then we're going to set it that when we change the value on the drop-down list, that grid will refresh automatically, as well as each time that we submit an enrollment for a course and a student, that grid will refresh and show the new data. So I'm going to do one more modification here, as I would want my grid to load underneath my form. So I'll just put a horizontal rule just so we have a little line to show, and then I'll create a div and I'll give this div an ID of data. So data or data div is going to store our partial view. Next up, we want to actually create this partial view. So we follow the same procedure as we did in the first part when we were creating views, where we right click our enrollments folder and we go ahead and click add and view. Next, we want to give it a name. So I'm going to call this enrollments partial, and using the underscore at the front is really just a naming convention. Some people would create a folder for the partials. I just use an underscore to depict whenever I have a partial view, and that is a pattern that you may see in other places. Next, I want to select a template. So the template would be what kind of page do you want, and we would actually want a list because we want to list the students who are enrolled. So I'll just click list, and the model that should govern this is enrollment. Now you would see that I already have this clicked, but originally it may look like this, but once you click create as partial, you see that it blanks out the layout page because the partial view is actually going to inherit all its scripts and styles and all of that from whatever view it is being rendered in, which inherently is inheriting that from the layout page. So that will automatically get grayed out. And then we click add. All right, so if we'll take a quick look at the resulting view, we'll see that it looks just like our index page. So if I go to index and I load it up, you could almost hold them up side by side and see that they're pretty much identical. So essentially the list template gives you whatever comes up in your index page, or your index page is actually using the list template. So we're going to modify this a bit. We have a table, yes, and we can leave grade. We can leave course title, and you do notice that you have course.title. So course is the entity that is included in enrollment. And the reason I said included is that if we take a look at our index controller, we'll see kind of what is happening here. So when we load up var enrollments and we run that query, you'll see that there's a part that says .include, and it includes each entity that is necessary for data. So this is called eager loading, where you're saying I'm bringing back each record here and then just include the corresponding or related data for each foreign key. So do you recall that our enrollments table is full of foreign keys? It has course ID, student ID, and lecturer ID. So we're just saying bring back all of the resulting information for the corresponding course ID, student ID, and lecturer ID. And so in our view, it will actually just allow us to say model, which represents enrollment, dot whichever entity, dot whichever property of that entity. So I can leave the course title, and you see that student.last name is coming back. We don't necessarily just want the last name. We don't want last name, comma, first name, or the full name. So these are really just the table headers, like we would have seen when we looked at the enrollments list, and that is why it looks this way. So we get to modify all of this. Essentially, however, these are just the display name for us. So really and truly what is being displayed when this is rendered is really just whatever meta tag or display name we had put over the corresponding property in our meta class. I'm just going to do a few modifications as it relates to what we need to see. So we definitely want to see the grade and the course title and the student name. I don't want this to render student last name only though, so I'm going to take this out and I'm going to say student name because I'm going to be rendering values that are their full names. I also don't need to see lecturer's first name or anything with the lecturer right now, and we can probably just render that one time, so I can take that out. So our table should have these 3 table headers and 1 blank one. I can just say action because maybe we want to complete an action. You notice that this column is reserved for these buttons, but we'll get there. So for each row coming back in our enrollments, and I need the grade, so I'll leave that. I need the course title, I'll leave that, and I don't need the student's last name. What I really need is the student's full name, so I can just replicate this. All right, so this is a display for where it's actually rendering whatever value is there, and I'll just say student.first name and space student.last name. And if you want to wrap this all in a p tag or something else, you can do that. We removed the column header for the lecturer's first name or the lecturer information, so I'll just remove this altogether. And for the actions, well, I would only want the ability to delete an enrollment, so I'm going to take this out. If you deem it necessary to have others, then that's fine. So we'll be modifying this also to make sure that when we click delete, we don't have to navigate away from the page. It just removes that enrollment record and refreshes the grid accordingly. Now we can save changes made to our action. And one other thing, we can remove this because I don't want the ability to create. We're already on the creation screen, so we don't need to render a link for creation. Now that we've completed the view, we need to actually add the action for this partial view in our controller. So remember that no view gets invoked unless a corresponding action is present. So we need to give this action the same name as the partial view. So I'm just going to copy that from the Solution Explorer just to make sure I don't mistype. And I'm going to place it immediately after index. So there are going to be a few differences, and you may see it done this way. You may see people do it using action result just the same. So there are many ways to do this. I'm going to show you with partial view result because I like to see what is a partial view and what is an action review or a full view, even from my controller side. So I'm going to say partial view result, and note I'm not making this one asynchronous because at least in this version of MVC, they don't support asynchronous partial views. So be very careful of that. So I'm making public partial view result, giving it the same name. And then inside of this, I'm going to be returning partial view. Now the work isn't done as yet because remember that our partial view requires data. It's looking for an IEnumerable object collection of enrollment object types. So that means before I can return, I need to return it with some data. So just the same way with index that has the same list pattern, we loaded up data and then we returned that data to the view. We need to follow a similar pattern here. So I'm going to say var enrollments, and I can do that because enrollment is local to this function, so it won't interfere with that enrollments variable. And I'm going to say db.enrollments. But then do recall that in our partial view, we need details for course and we need details for the student. So I'm going to just borrow this code here from index that includes course based on the relating record and student. And I'm going to follow that pattern here and load those in. Now that I have my query done, I'm going to return the partial view with the enrollments, and I'll just say to list. Our next action item would be to add a parameter to our action. So the parameter will serve the purpose of allowing us to filter on whatever values in that parameter. Take, for instance, the details action where it receives an ID and then it checks if the ID is null, sure, but then what it really wants the ID for is to just find that one record. So we need to add a similar filtering mechanism to our action based on the course ID. So I can just add int and I'll make it nullable. So this is how you make it nullable, by just putting on that question mark. It suggests that a null value is acceptable coming in when you're calling this action. All right. And we're going to say course ID, just so we know exactly which ID is being referred to. The next thing we want to do is adjust our query because right now we're bringing back enrollments or all enrollments. So we want to filter on just course ID. So I'm just going to inject that code here and I'm just going to break the line a bit so that we can see exactly what's happening. So you can actually do this without causing any errors. And I'm just going to say dot where. And I'm adding on a filter. So this is me adding on a lambda expression with my where clause to say where q dot course ID is equivalent to the parameter course ID. So doing this will actually allow that this view can be rendered without any course ID, and of course a query like that where this is 0 and we know that we have no course ID being 0, or this is null actually, and we have no course ID being null, will actually return an empty list to our partial view. So if you wanted this to be a bit more user-friendly, we could add an if statement in this partial to say if model being our list, and we can say dot count to mean the number of items coming back in this list is less than 1. Sorry, count is a function. So if model count is less than 1, then we can say render an h1 tag to say no enrollments in this course. So that can apply whether we get back an empty set, because remember that even if we get back a course ID, If this course has no enrollments as yet, then we want to let them know there are currently no enrollments in this course. And we can put this in a bootstrap class, maybe text dash, well, we can center align it for sure. And we can say text dash info. All right. So then we will get this nice blue text letting the user know that there are no enrollments in this class. And then we can wrap the rest of this page in an else to say if this does not evaluate true, then we want to print this entire table. So I just use that plus sign on the side to just collapse everything, and I'll just do one cut and paste, and there we go. So the table gets rendered when the list is not empty. All right, so now that we've tested that theory where the partial view loads, we're just going to remove this line because we don't want this to interfere with our Ajax call. So what we want to do is make sure that on page load, our selected value from our drop-down list gets rendered or gets used to render the partial view. So when we have this HTML action, is just calling the action blankly with no parameters, and so we'll always get that there's no enrollment because we'll be passing a null. So I can just remove this, or for now I'll just comment it out for further reference, but then we'll go ahead and start writing some JavaScript or jQuery Ajax code. So a quick and easy way to write jQuery when we're loading a page is just to start a jQuery function. So we know the pattern is $ open and close parentheses, and then in the for open one I'll put in function, and I'll just open and close everything so we can just see where everything starts and stops. And I like seeing my curly brace and my parentheses beside each other. And then inside this function, the first thing I want to do is know what the course ID is, that the selected value from this course ID drop-down list. So I'm going to get this value from this control by targeting it using its ID. So $, open brace, open quotation marks, and hashtag course ID, and then I will say .val, and that actually gets me the value that is currently selected. And I'm just going to put that inside of a variable. So I'll say var CID, just for short. All right, so var CID is getting the currently selected course ID value. Next, we'll do an Ajax call, and it's going to look similar to this, but I'm going to put in a few different parameters and options, and I'll explain as I go along. So I'll start the Ajax call, $.ajax, and just fill in all the required syntax. And then we put in our options. So the first option is the URL. So I could write the URL like this, but I'm going to write it a different way, just so you have exposure to all of your options. So I'm going to write @URL. So I'm using an HTML helper function URL .action. All right. So you'll see that there are different ways to approach this. There's no one way, no way set in stone. So you'll see different patterns around the place. So I want to show you what you may see during your research. All right. And then we have enrollment partial. And just the same way we wrote the HTML action with the action and the controller, I'll just rewrite it in the same fashion. The next option we want is the data type. Now our data type this time won't be JSON, but rather we'll use HTML. So you have different data types for different situations. In this situation, we are loading HTML data. So I want the data type to be HTML. And on that note, I'll just add content type, and I'll just fill in that char set setting for HTML. All right, so we're seeing that our content type should be of type HTML with char set UTF-8. So you can just fill that in also. I don't think that one is absolutely necessary, but it's good practice just to make sure that the correct character sets are being returned. And we'll set the type to be get. Since we're not posting data this time, we're getting data. And remember your commas after each option as we go along. And then we have data. So of course, we need to pass data in because our action is expecting some form of data, as much as it may be forgiving because we put a nullable parameter there, but we are expected to pass in data to get the actual result. So we need to say course ID, since that's the name of the parameter it's expecting, and then we'll pass in our local value, which is CID. All right, so I didn't give this the name course ID because then you may get confused if you have course ID colon course ID. So I did this as CID just so you could see clearly that this is corresponding on the left side is corresponding with the parameter that's expected, and on the right side it corresponds with whatever value we're passing into that. And then after data we have success. So we need to define a function that gets called when a successful call is made, and when a successful call is made, it is expected that we get back some form of data in the form of this list. So I'm going to say data. And in this function, we are going to populate our data div with our, data. So we're already calling our partial view, and we're just going to say inside of that data div, we want to load this partial view with this data. So I'm going to put in some animations so we can see how powerful jQuery really is and how it's easy to make a nice interactive application. So hashtag data, targeting the element by its ID, and I'm going to say fade out. So this will make it actually kind of blank out, and you can bolster that by adding the speed or, all right, so remember that we did the fade out earlier. You could put in fast or slow, whatever speed you want, but I want it to fade out. And then I'm going to load the HTML area with content coming from our data. And then once it's loaded, I want it to fade in. All right, so this will actually get called once the page is loaded. So traditionally with jQuery, you would see something like $document.ready, which means, oh, the page is now loaded, the DOM is now ready to interact with JavaScript. But then for shorthand, you can just write it like this. All right, so this should execute once the page loads. All right, so I'm just going to debug quickly, and I set a breakpoint on my controller so that we can see when it gets called and what value gets passed to it. Okay, so now we're going to browse to our create page, and then we're going to watch as Visual Studio hits our breakpoint, and we see that course ID is indeed being passed into our partial view. And the end result of all of this should be that the queries run against number 2 ID. So only those enrollments should come back, and voila, there we see that we're running a filter based on the selected course, and we're only seeing those students. Of course, we haven't hooked up anything when this value changes, so that is our next mission, where when it changes, it should actually reload. Now what we need on our drop down is a change event. So jQuery makes it just as easy to create a change event, just the same way that we did a change event here, just the same way that we did an event here on our text box, we did an autocomplete. So it is a similar pattern when we want a drop down list change. So to do that, we can just target our element. So we just say $, and we know that we're dealing with course ID as our element. And then we put on the change event. And then inside the change event, and I'm just going to put my semicolon on the end at the same time, we have a function. And then in this function, what we need to do is get the current value of course ID. So we can actually just replicate this, where we just get CID and the current value. And of course, once again, this is its own block, this is its own block, so the CIDs won't interfere with each other. All right, and then we need to repeat this whole block of code. Now, there's a principle in programming that says don't repeat yourself. It's an acronym that spells DRY. And the principle is that if you have a block of code that can do something, and it is supposed to be versatile enough to operate in different scenarios, then you shouldn't have it all over the place. So for now, I'm going to just copy and paste it, but what we aim to do is put this block of code in its own function, and then we can call it from multiple places without having all of this repeated. But for now, I'm just going to repeat it, and we'll just test that our click event works. Now, at this point, you may want to go ahead and test, and if you do, you may realize that it's not working, and that's because we are invoking jQuery here, but we are not putting it inside of a jQuery block. And by a jQuery block, I mean this function. So remember that I said every time we start off with jQuery, you may either see something like this with $document.ready, or you see this, which is the shorthand. So whatever jQuery code you're about to write needs to go inside of that block. So the Ajax, the event, all of that needs to be inside of that block. So I can just cut this. I can start another block because here's a block for itself. This is just a standard JavaScript function. These are JavaScript functions, but this is a jQuery block, and this is a jQuery block. So I'm going to put this inside here, and actually we could just merge all of these into one. So this jQuery function block really ends here. And any other jQuery code that we want to put in, we could just make sure that it is kind of self-contained. All right. So I'm putting in my course ID on change function block, and it is somewhat autonomous to anything else that is inside of this block. And I'll just align everything so we can see where everything starts and stops. Now, when we attempt to debug this, we will see an improvement in the behavior of our application, where when we change the drop-down list, the grid reloads. Okay, now with our page loaded, I'm going to proceed to change, and then we'll see what happens. So I left my breakpoint on the action, and when I change the calculus, you see it hits the action, and we're getting a new course ID. So the filtering should bring back only persons enrolled in calculus. And if I bring back MVC.NET or Java programming, I think that one was empty. Then we see our if statement is working, no enrollments in this course. And we can go ahead and just make sure everything works. So I'll just add an Ledford and enroll student. And we see that we still have one more adjustment to make, because this does not reload if we change it. And I'll just remove my breakpoint here and change it back to Java programming, then we see that Ledford was enrolled. So what we need to happen is that when we click this button, this grid actually reloads when a successful enrollment occurs. So I'm not going to come out of debug mode. I'm just going to go to my create, and really and truly, I just need a few more lines of code to make that work. Now, the first adjustment I'm going to make is to reduce the repetition that is all over the place. So we see that we're repeating this block of code here that is loading our grid. And right now we're threatened to repeat it once more. So I'm going to create a function. And once again, because I'll be doing something that is jQuery-like, this function needs to be inside of our jQuery block. So I'm going to create a function right here, and I'm going to call it load enrollments. I mean, you can create the function and call it whatever you like, and it should receive a parameter called CID. All right. And then inside this function, I'm going to take all of this block of code and place it. So we have our Ajax, and I'll just indent. So we have CID, which is expected to be passed in anytime this is called, and this will handle our reload. So that means when the page is loaded, we just took out this code out of the page load. So I need to make sure I make a function call here first thing in my jQuery, so that once the page is loaded, this will execute first, and I'm passing in CID, which is being siphoned from the drop-down list, and that is the first reference to it. And the second reference to it would be inside of my change function for the drop-down list. So I can just remove all of this and replace it with one line, load enrollments. And once again, we have the CID. Now, what we really want to address is reloading after a successful addition. So I'm just going to copy these two lines. And if you recall, our code that handles the successful additions is our onSuccess added function. So we just look for added, and we see here that we got added All right, and the result is success. So if it is successful, then we want to reload. So we had code for fading out those grids. So I can just add the code underneath all of this, and I'll add it underneath this commented outline. And here we just add that we're getting the course ID and we're passing it into the function. And so that should take care of calling the load enrollments anytime we want our grid of enrollments to be refreshed. So I'm still in debug mode. I'm just going to save these adjustments and I'm going to reload my page. And remember, on page load, it loads the grid. On drop down list change, it loads the grid. And upon enrollment, and I'll just put in an enrollment. So that didn't work because of a scoping issue where our function added, which is what is called upon a successful operation from our Ajax form, is outside of the scope of this jQuery block. And the funny thing is that if we add it to the scope of the jQuery block, then the Ajax form will not be able to detect it. So that puts us in a weird position where we're actually going to have to repeat the code, at least for now, just to get this working. So I'll just reproduce this and notice that function added is invoking its own jQuery block. That's so that we could use the jQuery here. All right. So I'm just going to load it up there inside of this jQuery function, and we should see an improvement in our behavior. All right, so I'm going to attempt to add a student to Introduction to C#. And there we see that we actually get that reload and that student is added real time. All right, and then if we try to add again, then we get our error message. And if we switch, we see that our filtering works. So this is how you can go about developing a nice interactive form and experience for your users and easing the need to navigate between screens. So I'm going to challenge you to actually add similar behavior to the delete action. I'm going to do it and I'm going to check in the code so that you have it to reference, but I want you to actually try and do it based on everything that you have learned up to now. You would also notice that navigating between these course selections, this error message does not disappear. So those are little housekeeping things that you probably want to do to your page, where on change event, you probably set those displays to none. So I'm just going to copy this quickly and look for my on change event, which is here. And I'm going to say on change, I want to fade out anything that is on the screen. So if there's anything on the screen, just fade it out. And if I try that again, well, I would have to refresh just to make sure it's working. So I'm going to invoke an error. And then if I move to another page, you see that it disappears and everything reloads quite well. All right.